For 50 years, Moscow built one of the biggest energy networks on Earth. Gigantic oil refineries, countless kilometers of pipelines, vast storage facilities, and a labyrinth of road and rail networks linking everything together. Different pieces of the same puzzle, all with one unifying purpose: to power the largest country on the planet. Generations of Soviet and then Russian planners constructed a system of almost unprecedented size and scale, generating enough fuel to not just keep the lights on in tens of millions of homes, but to support and strengthen the nation's entire economy, as well as its military, imbuing Russia with incredible power and influence on the global stage. For decades, that same system was, without doubt, one of the country's biggest strengths, and it retained that strength even through times of hardship. It survived the breakdown of the Soviet Union. It withstood economic crises and international sanctions. It stood firm through periods of political upheaval, and it became even bigger and better as the years went by. An unparalleled industrial behemoth, fueling one of the largest armed forces on Earth. But that monster may have finally met its match, as a system that once seemed unshakable is quite literally crumbling, and it's all thanks to Ukraine. In the month of May alone, Kyiv's forces struck multiple major Russian oil facilities, with the likes of refineries and critical logistics sites being set ablaze. And it didn't even require high-end bombers or expensive missiles. Relatively cheap and simple long-range drones were more than enough to get the job done. The result isn't just an economic crisis for Moscow to contend with, but an existential one, as the very foundations its country has been built on begin to fall apart. For Ukraine, meanwhile, this may be how the war is won, not by destroying Russia's army, but by breaking the very system that allows it to exist. But before we look at the impacts of Ukraine's campaign, we must first look at what it's actually targeting. The headlines focus mostly on oil refineries and fuel tanks, but it's actually much, much more than that. The Soviets didn't spend decades simply constructing oil plants. They built a vast and complex industrial machine, a machine that extends across thousands of square miles of land, from the oil fields of Siberia to towns, cities, and military bases many miles away. The first pieces of this machine were put into place in the aftermath of the Second World War. As the Soviet Union was emerging as a global superpower, those in the highest positions of power realized something important, something that would define geopolitics around the world for generations to come: fuel is power. Military vehicles needed, civilian vehicles needed, factories needed, entire economies needed. And the Soviet Union was lucky enough to be sitting right on top of some of the world's biggest reserves of oil and gas. They didn't need to look far to find the energy that would make them rich and powerful, but they did need to come up with ways to exploit and transport it. So began one of the grandest infrastructure projects the world has ever seen. It took years, decades in fact. But one piece at a time, the Soviets brought their vision to life. They made refineries, pumping stations, oil terminals, processing centers, and so much more. New facilities sprang up across the more than 6.6 million square miles that make up the Russian Federation today. And the Soviets didn't just want this system to power their peacetime economy, they needed it to be able to withstand a war as well. Because they'd seen what had happened during the Second World War. They saw how supply chains buckled and broke beneath the weight of invasion, and they'd seen the clear connections between countries' industrial resilience and their ability to survive periods of conflict and crisis. So to make their system as war-proof as possible, they made it layered and interconnected, with resiliency and redundancy in the form of backup systems and fail-safes. The various nodes of the system were also linked up. Rail links connected to depots, depots to pipelines, and pipelines to refineries. And by the heyday of the Cold War, this system was rapidly becoming one of the biggest and best on Earth. And it wasn't just being used for Soviet homes, businesses, and industries, but as an increasingly important economic advantage too. Oil exports were ramping up with every passing year, funneling vast amounts of money into Moscow's coffers. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. But it didn't actually matter, at least not to the energy sector. Even though it was a period of enormous change and political upheaval for Russia on the whole, and the other former Soviet nations, all the infrastructure that had been built up to that point, as well as all the potential for power and wealth it represented, remained. The newfound Russian Federation effectively inherited a fully functioning economy, powered by those pipelines, refineries, and other facilities. They made some changes as the years passed, of course. Names changed, so did the companies owning and operating these facilities. Many were expanded and modernized as time passed too, but the bones of the system were there to begin with and can still be seen today. Many of the country's biggest refineries have been standing for decades, like the Omsk refinery, for example, which was commissioned way back in 1955. All Russia had to do was build on that bedrock, improve the existing infrastructure, make it more efficient, more productive, and better aligned with the changing standards of the modern era. And the man to take charge of such a mammoth task was none other than Vladimir Putin himself, who came to power at the turn of the millennium. Around that time, cracks were starting to show in the Soviet infrastructure. Pipelines were getting a little rusty and refineries were showing their age, mostly making low-quality, heavy fuel oil rather than the higher-quality forms of diesel and gasoline that the world was transitioning towards. Putin was eager to stop the slide. So over the 2000s and into the 2010s, the Kremlin poured literally tens of billions of dollars into the country's facilities. Energy giants like Gazprom and Lukoil even brought in some of the Western world's best engineers to carry out an extensive overhaul of the infrastructure. They worked tirelessly to integrate more advanced equipment into the aging frameworks, breathing new life into facilities that looked to be on their last legs. It was an extremely expensive and time-consuming project, but it worked. All of a sudden, Russia's refineries were churning out some of the finest fuels, and the country was no longer exporting just raw materials but actively powering large parts of Europe itself, supplying a massive percentage of the continent's diesel while still having plenty left over to power its own industries and military machines. This veritable miracle of modern engineering had been more than 50 years in the making, but it was at last complete, and appeared destined to be the beating heart of Russia's economy and expansion for decades, if not centuries, to come. But there was a hidden flaw in this machine. A flaw that nobody could have seen, certainly not the Soviets, who would never have anticipated the types of military technologies the 21st century would bring. They built their system around a relatively small number of massive refineries, each responsible for a large part of the country's overall fuel production, rather than a large number of smaller facilities. That matters, because if there were dozens or even hundreds of smaller refineries dotted across the Russian map, each taking on a small percentage of the total production, it wouldn't necessarily make that much difference if a few of them were damaged or destroyed during a war. But when you have these enormous mega-complexes that are so important and influential, they become equally enormous targets for any enemies that might want to damage your economy. The Soviets thought that these facilities were safe, since many of them were built deep into Russia's regions, dozens or even hundreds of miles away from international borders. The idea of any military opponent being able to target them would have seemed absurd at the time, especially with Russia being such a large military power. But then along came Ukraine, and along came the age of drone warfare, and everything changed. It didn't happen right away. In fact, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it was able to leverage the wealth and power of its incredible oil industry, not just for the opening exchanges but for the first couple of years of the conflict. Indeed, the Kremlin's energy sector was, for a long time, its biggest advantage. It didn't just have a much bigger army than Ukraine, but it had a colossal amount of infrastructure to support that army. It walked into the war with vast fuel reserves, unparalleled oil refining capacities, and an energy industry that could sustain military operations on a massive scale for years on end. Because modern warfare is highly dependent on fuel, conflicts consume energy. Tanks, aircraft, warships, and armored vehicles, for example, burn through large amounts of fuel in no time. Supply convoys can stretch for miles and expend incalculable quantities of diesel and gasoline as they move food, ammo, and other supplies from A to B. Then there are all the generators, communications systems, radars, air defenses, and pieces of field infrastructure that also require a steady stream of petroleum products to remain operational. Most countries around the world wouldn't be able to produce the supply to meet such high levels of demand. But Russia could, and it was all thanks to that infrastructure it had spent so long piecing together. The nations of the Western world quickly realized this. They saw that Russia would almost inevitably be able to march its way to victory if it was allowed to continue exporting oil far and wide, bringing in billions of dollars of revenue in the process. So they did what they could to stifle the flow. They imposed sanctions, they froze assets, they reduced their reliance on Russian resources. They hoped that by economically isolating Russia, they would be able to limit its ability to sustain its campaign of conquest. But they didn't quite go far enough, fast enough. They did what they could, but Russia found ways to adapt. It made use of shadow fleet tankers to transport vast quantities of fuel while evading penalties, for example, and shifted its attention eastward rather than westward, finding new buyers and trade partners across Asia to replace those it had lost in Europe. Revenue did decline in some areas, but the infrastructure remained operational and the core of the system survived. And so even years into the war, while it was struggling to achieve its military objectives, Russia's war machine was still running. Fuel was still flowing, funds were still being generated, and it seemed as though the Kremlin could carry on like this almost indefinitely. For Ukraine, that was a terrifying prospect. It effectively meant that no matter how hard the Ukrainian defense forces worked, no matter how well they dug in and defended their ground, no matter how much they slowed the enemy's advances, the war was only going to end one way, with a Russian victory. It would take time and it would come at great cost, but as long as Russia had that near-endless supply of fuel, then Putin would get what he wanted in the end. Western sanctions weren't enough to stop the enemy. It was up to Ukraine to take matters into its own hands. This was the moment that Kyiv's forces made the biggest and most important strategic shift of the entire war. Up until then, they'd fought the war according to conventional rules. They'd focused on the obvious threats right in front of them: the tanks, the artillery, the armored personnel carriers, the ammunition depots and supply lines. They'd done what almost any military force would do when its land is being invaded. They'd tried to defend their territory by fighting back against the enemy directly, making use of home ground advantage and intelligent tactics to outwit their opponent and destroy as many military assets as they could. It was a logical approach, and there was value to it. It mattered when Ukraine's forces blew up Russian tanks or wiped out an assault squad that was hell-bent on capturing a key frontline location. But there was also a massive problem with the plan. Russia had depth, incredible depth. It had vast Soviet stockpiles of tanks to turn to when its more modern models were damaged and destroyed. It had tens of thousands of armored vehicles. It had jets, bombers, and artillery systems galore, and it had little trouble replacing both equipment and soldiers almost instantly after they were taken out. Like the mythical Hydra, the Kremlin's war machine was almost unkillable. Every time Ukraine thought it had scored a win, Russia simply bounced back with more armor, more munitions, and more men. Finally, however, Ukraine's military masterminds uncovered the secret that would change the course of the war. If you want to rid yourself of an invasive weed, you don't just trim away the leaves, you get right down to the roots, you kill it at the source. The same logic applied to the Russian army. To defeat something this vast and with this much depth, Ukraine couldn't rely on picking off tanks and soldiers alone. It had to strike at the source and destroy the very system that allowed the army to function. That system boiled down to one simple thing: fuel. Fuel is at the heart of every major military operation in the modern era. Without fuel, armies go nowhere. Jets and bombers are grounded, artillery stops firing, and tanks turn from destructive machines of chaos and carnage into pointless metal boxes. And so Ukraine began to look beyond the front lines. It looked past the tanks, armored vehicles, and brigades directly in front of it. And in doing so, it began to see the real beating heart of the enemy's military machine: the refineries, the pipelines, the pieces of infrastructure that kept everything else fueled and moving. It realized that taking out one tank would barely register on the enemy's radars, but taking out an entire depot and cutting off fuel to 100 tanks would have a much more significant impact. And it had the perfect tool for the job: drones. Cheap and easy to mass produce, capable of traveling long distances, far enough to reach those same refineries and facilities the Soviets assumed were untouchable, and surprisingly difficult to stop as well. These were the perfect weapons to rip out the very heart of the Russian military. And so began the next phase of the war: Ukraine's systematic eradication of Russia's most important infrastructure. If this is the kind of insight that you want more of, then make sure that you are subscribed to The Military Show. We break it down like this every single week. The first Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil infrastructure occurred in late 2023. There were additional sporadic strikes throughout 2024. In 2025, the campaign ramped up, with the strikes becoming increasingly regular and devastating. By 2026, Ukraine was effectively all in on the idea of taking out as much of Russia's energy sector as it possibly could. Indeed, by late May 2026, Ukraine had carried out over 150 of these attacks. 32 of them came in the first 5 months of the year alone. That's almost as many as the country managed in the whole of 2024, showing just how much more ferocious and efficient Kyiv's efforts have become as time has gone by. And the attacks aren't just more frequent, but more damaging too. Ukraine today has better and bigger drones than ever before, capable of going further and carrying larger payloads than their predecessors. Every impact matters more. Every explosion is bigger, every fire burns brighter, and every attack leaves Russia with increasingly vast amounts of damage to tally and increasingly expensive bills to cover. Kyiv's forces have also been systematically taking out as many of Russia's air defenses as they can locate and identify, which also helps the greater cause, as it opens up gaps and pathways for drones to fly through unopposed. This in turn helps Ukraine target refineries, pipelines, and fuel depots even further from the front lines, without having to worry about their drones being shot down en route. It's a strategy that has taken a lot of time and effort to put together, and Ukraine has had to be patient to see the fruits of its labor. But now, at last, those fruits are clear to see as Russia's economy, as well as its ability to wage the war, is quite literally going up in flames at a far faster rate than the country can handle. The best evidence for this, too, came in May 2026 when Ukraine carried out not one, not two, not three, but 7 successive strikes on some of the biggest and most valuable energy sector sites in all of Russia. The first incident occurred on May 5th, when Ukrainian strike drones attacked the Kryvyi oil refinery in the city of Kryvyi in Russia's Leningrad region. Owned by Surgutneftegas, it's the second largest oil refinery in the country. It processed an extraordinary 17.5 million tons of crude oil in 2024 alone. That's 6.6% of the country's entire refining capacity. The single refinery was responsible for producing around 2 million tons of gasoline, over 7 million tons of diesel, 6 million more tons of fuel oil, and around 600,000 tons of bitumen. But on May 5th, the entire facility was forced to shut down. Ukraine's drones damaged 3 of its 4 crude distillation units, or CDUs. To understand why this matters, we have to understand what CDUs actually are. When raw crude oil is extracted from the ground, it's not of much use to mankind. It's a thick, sticky, complex mixture of hydrocarbons that has to be refined to become useful. The first big step of that refining process is fractional distillation. This involves raw crude being pumped through huge furnaces and heated to extreme temperatures to become mostly vapor. That vapor then flows into large steel towers, CDUs, which contain dozens of racks of specialized trays. As it rises, the vapor cools and the various hydrocarbons and other components condense on the trays at different heights within the tower. Those various substances can then be funneled off for various uses like jet fuel, diesel, and gasoline. So without CDUs, refineries would simply be stuck with oil in its rawest form, unable to separate it or process it further. That's what makes them such perfect targets for Ukraine, because if you stop the CDUs, you essentially stop the refinery from functioning. Other targets might seem more impactful in the moment. When Ukraine's drones blow up fuel storage tanks, for example, it produces big fireballs that look impressive in the viral videos that soon spread across social media, but don't actually affect the flow of oil all that much. In the case of tanks, for example, Russia can often replace them, sometimes within a matter of hours. With CDUs, however, even seemingly small amounts of damage have huge, broad effects, because they impact the entire facility. On top of that, while refineries are operational, CDUs are literally filled with highly flammable and volatile vapors. It doesn't take too much to set those vapors ablaze, triggering high-pressure fires that can warp the surrounding steel structure and may take days to put out. There's also the fact that CDUs are quite large, often measuring up to 200 feet in height. That makes them bigger and easier targets for Ukraine's drone operators, even at night or in low-visibility conditions. But perhaps the biggest and best advantage of them all is this: CDUs are very hard to replace. Especially now, and especially in Russia. They can't just be mass-produced in factories, and thanks to sanctions, they're not easily imported either. They contain an array of specific internal components like precision control valves and specialized sensors, some of which are only made in certain places by certain businesses. Many of those businesses refuse to deal with Russia in any way, forcing the Kremlin's engineers to make do with whatever random parts they can find elsewhere. This, in turn, can lead to them having to spend months literally repairing damaged CDUs, and during that time, facilities either can't operate or are forced to function at massively reduced capacity. That's exactly what happened at Kryvyi, where huge fires broke out after a Ukrainian drone swarm paid the facility a visit. This was confirmed in satellite imagery analyzed by NASA firms. Ukraine's security service, SBU, also confirmed the attack, adding that the unmanned systems forces, together with special operations forces, had also struck a storage tank at an adjacent pumping station, giving Russia another big blaze to tackle. And while they were busy dealing with the aftermath of the attack, Ukraine's drone pilots were already preparing for the next one. On May 7th, they struck again. This time, their target was the Perm-Nos refinery, situated in the Perm region, around 1,460 kilometers or 908 miles east of Moscow, and even further from the front lines. Owned by Lukoil, one of Russia's biggest energy businesses, This is the 7th largest refinery by processing volume in Russia, boasting an annual throughput of over 12 million tons. That's around 250,000 barrels of oil every day. In 2024, it produced 2 million tons of gasoline, over 5 million tons of diesel, and hundreds of thousands of tons of coke and fuel oil too. But not anymore. According to Reuters and other news agencies, the drones damaged 3 of the facility's primary distillation units, which were all forced to shut down, representing half of the refinery's entire production capacity. A 4th distillation unit had already been taken out on April 30th in another drone attack. So in total, the refinery has been made to operate at a mere fraction of its usual levels. A week later, Russia was reeling all over again. Yet another of its huge refineries was set on fire in the city of Ryazan after another precision drone strike. In the early hours of May 15th, local residents took to social media, sharing reports of explosions and the sounds of drones overhead. Within hours, videos and images flooded the internet, showing hungry flames lapping at the night sky and vast plumes of black smoke rising over the refinery. Soon after, local authorities were forced to confirm that there had been damage to an industrial facility, which was soon identified as the Ryazan oil refinery. Owned by Rosneft, it's another enormous oil processing plant with an annual refining capacity of around 17 million tons. Ukrainian monitoring channel Supernova Plus reported that vacuum distillation units were burning at the facility. And this refinery is known to have 4 main CDUs, as well as additional facilities for vacuum gas oil hydrotreating, catalytic reforming, and other important processes. If any one of those components were damaged, it's highly likely that this refinery too will be operating far below its peak production levels for the foreseeable future. Engineers had barely begun assessing the damage in Ryazan when drones were spotted in the skies of Moscow on May 17th. Their target, unsurprisingly, was yet another oil refinery. The Gazprom Neft-owned refinery in southeastern Moscow, to be precise, a subsidiary of Gazprom where operations had to be suspended after UAVs collided with the facility. Mayor of Moscow, Sergei Sobyanin, confirmed the incident and downplayed the damage to the public, but anonymous sources later stated that it would take at least several days before the plant would be working again. And this isn't just any plant, it's one of the main fuel sources for the Russian capital, directly impacting the millions of people and thousands of businesses that call the city home. Like other facilities, the Moscow refinery also boasts some big numbers. It processed 11.6 million tons of crude oil in 2024 and produced around 3 million tons of gasoline, another 3 million tons of diesel, and around 1.3 million tons of bitumen. Ukraine wasn't stopping there. On May 20th, more drones hit another Lukoil refinery in the Nizhny Novgorod region, one of Russia's largest cities. Situated around 450 kilometers or 280 miles east of Moscow. This facility processes around 17 million tons of oil per year, making it Russia's 4th largest oil refinery. It's also the 2nd largest producer of gasoline, but it was forced to halt operations in the wake of the attack after the main CDU suffered damage. That single CDU is responsible for around half of the facility's total capacity, which works out at 190,000 barrels per day. Images and videos published after the strike showed a large fire and visible damage to the CDU structure, piling even more pressure on Russia's beleaguered energy sector. And if Russia thought it could take a moment to catch its breath, it was dead wrong. Only a day after the previous attack, yet another occurred in yet another region. On May 21st, drones struck the main CDU at the Rosneft-owned Syzran refinery in the Samara region. That same CDU handles 70% of the plant's capacity, and it had to be shut down following the attack, with repairs estimated to take at least a month. This refinery usually gets through around 170,000 barrels of oil a day to produce 1.5 million tons of diesel and massive amounts of gasoline and fuel oil each year. However, at least for the time being, it's not doing any of that, and Ukraine's May mayhem still wasn't over. On the night of May 25th, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine confirmed their 7th successful oil infrastructure strike of the month. This time they focused on an oil depot, the Belets depot near the city of Unetcha in the Bryansk region, to be precise, just a few dozen kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Capable of destroying over 40,000 tons of petroleum products, this location is of huge importance to the Russian military. It's where the Kremlin keeps large amounts of fuel that go directly into the convoy of trucks, transporting supplies and ammo to the frontline units in places like Kursk and Belgorod. Residents reported explosions and smoke filling the skies over the depot, with early estimates suggesting a minimum of 3 tanks plus a pipeline had been damaged. At the very same time, Ukraine's defense forces were also taking out several other targets in other locations, like an ammo depot in Crimea and an artillery depot in Donetsk. But it was the Belets depot that arguably mattered most, because that means that far less fuel will be able to make its way to Russian units that have come to rely on this specific location. This in turn harms the overall mobility of the Kremlin's army, as they'll have to wait and delay their next moves while emergency supplies are sourced from elsewhere. Every day, Russians are impacted too, as numerous sources showed an immediate increase in fuel prices throughout the border regions the day after the attack. On their own, as isolated incidents, attacks like this wouldn't necessarily have that much impact. Russia can cope with 1 or 2 of its big refineries having to temporarily shut down and can deal with the logistical challenges of the odd fuel depot being set on fire. Cumulatively, however, it cannot hope to contend with the devastating effects of all of these attacks, especially when they occur so close together. Its oil production levels are plummeting to dangerous and unprecedented depths, and when less oil is being processed, everything is affected. Tanks and other vehicles can't be fueled up and used for frontline assaults. Supplies like food and ammo can't get to where they need to be. The whole war effort is forced to slow down and stagnate, which opens up more opportunities for Ukrainian forces, which aren't having to deal with the same kind of crisis to strike at weak points in the Russian lines and force their enemy back. Meanwhile, Russia also has less oil to export. That means less revenue flowing into the country's coffers, which means less money to spend on everything it needs to keep the war going, like production of drones and munitions, procurement, recruitment, salaries, etc. And with a weaker economy, everything else degrades, from education to healthcare and beyond. The country is already in a perilous state, with the Russian public seeing their quality of life dramatically decline because of the war, and it's only going to get worse as these oil attacks continue. There is no way out of this. No escape, no quick fix, no counter. Ukraine has proven it can strike wherever it wants, whenever it wants, leaving utter havoc in its wake, and Russia has demonstrated its utter inability to defend itself. For decades, the Soviets and Russians built up their energy empire. Putin himself has spent much of his time in power perfecting it and bringing it into the modern era. And now, in mere months, Ukraine is tearing it apart. You can learn more about how Putin has lost control of this war and how Ukraine has turned the tide in this video. Alternatively, check out this video to learn about how Germany may have just changed the game, offering Ukraine a never-before-seen deal that could bring the war to a close far sooner than anyone expected. Don't forget to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos just like this, and thank you, as always, for watching.